My name is Jim Levine. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Trinity. Today I'd like to talk a bit about what philosophy is and what studying philosophy at Trinity involves. So there's two questions I want to try to answer to at least some extent. The first is, what is philosophy? The second, what does studying philosophy at Trinity involve? So first of all, for what is philosophy? Well, the word philosophy derives from the Greek, from philo meaning love, and Sophia meaning wisdom, so love of wisdom. One thing to know about philosophy, especially if you choose to study it, is that it's an essentially contested or debated discipline. In philosophy, it's not about gaining knowledge of certain views or beliefs that are widely and commonly accepted as regarded as a body of knowledge. Rather, it's about certain fundamental issues that are continued to be debated. So in the broadest of terms, philosophy is often regarded as the attempt to gain an understanding of the most fundamental aspects of reality, of our ability to know things about the world, and of how best to live our lives. Another way to view philosophy is what we currently don't know. When Western philosophy began in Greece, with such philosophers as Plato and Aristotle, what they did was partly now we regard it as astronomy and physics and biology, all of which Aristotle had fairly developed views on. And then there's other parts of his work that we regard nowadays as his real pure philosophy. And it's commonly said that in the beginning, all attempt to know things about the world and about ourselves and our place in the world was philosophy. And when it became a subject area that was viewed on firm footing, it broke off from philosophy and became a science. So physics became a science, is regarded, with Newton and these people around the 17th century. In the 19th century, psychology was part of philosophy departments, and only toward the end of the 19th century did psychology become a separate department. Although even today there are a number of debated and philosophical issues regarding the nature of psychology and the mind that continue to this day. So on this view anyway, all learning was regarded as philosophy at the beginning, and then when it became on a solid footing, it became a science. And philosophy is what's left, is what we currently are still debating, the fundamental aspects of that aren't on a solid footing in the way that some sciences are. But some people anyway hope that what philosophy is now studying will become a science someday. And others, however, are more pessimistic, and they view what's left of philosophy anyway as a misguided attempt to raise questions that we are in no position to answer. This was a view that goes back to the ancient skeptics, but also in the 20th century is typified by Wittgenstein's view. So all I really want to point out is that everything's up for grabs in philosophy. There's people who think they can know the way that world ultimately is, and there's others who think that's a misguided attempt. And they're all philosophers debating these fundamental issues. However, whatever one's view of what philosophy is, the method of philosophy involves the reasoned defense of one's view. So if you study philosophy, you're partly trying to learn about what people think about the nature of reality and so forth. But it's not merely their views about it that's of interest, it's their arguments for the views. And if you study philosophy, it's about providing arguments for views that you are choosing to defend or to criticize the arguments you give against those views. So here's just a brief outline of some of the basic fundamental areas in philosophy. Sometimes philosophy is divided between the theoretical philosophy and what's called practical philosophy. So in the theoretical philosophy, one area, fundamental area, is called metaphysics, which is really the study of the ultimate nature of reality. So in doing metaphysics, you're asking, what does reality ultimately consist of? One sort of issue that has been a long-standing issue in metaphysics, certainly from Descartes onwards, is what is the status of minds and matter? Descartes, who you probably heard of, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am," he thought the universe was divided into two sorts of what he calls substances, two main fundamental sorts of entities: minds, or what he called thinking substance, and matter, or material substance. So Descartes thought there were both minds and matter. Matter is in space anyway, and as well as in time. Minds are in time, but not in space. They don't have any dimensions, and so are minds. Other people, in Descartes' time and as well as in our time, some of them think there's only material stuff in the universe. There are no minds. So for these people, they would have to explain, well, what is belief? What is desire? And they can't explain it as Descartes did, in thinking, in holding that there's a certain kind of special entity in the universe that's involved in thinking or desiring. They have to explain it in purely material terms. There's other philosophers who adopt what you might think is a less commonsensical view, is the view that there is no real material stuff in the universe, there's only mental stuff. These philosophers are called idealists because ultimately they think it's not that they're idealists in the sense of high aspirations, but ideal in the sense of the idea or relating to the mind. Trinity's most famous philosopher was George Berkeley, who wrote at the beginning of the 18th century, and he was famously an idealist who said all there really is minds and ideas in minds. So for Berkeley, to be is to be thought of or to be a thinking thing. And so there is no material substance. In addition to these sorts of issues about matter and minds, another sort of issue, and by no means the only other sort of issue that metaphysicians are concerned with, are there entities that are abstract, that are not in time at all, in the way that both matter and minds are thought to be in time by those who believe in these substances. So, for example, a number of philosophers are worried about the nature of mathematics and have thought, are there entities that mathematics is concerned with, entities such as numbers that are regarded as abstract, that are not in space and time? Anyway, these are a few of the sorts of issues that people who are concerned with metaphysics worry about. Another major part of theoretical philosophy is what's called theory of knowledge or epistemology. Here, the major issue is to what extent can we gain knowledge of the world and of ourselves? And in this regard, it's a challenge that's issued by a number of philosophers, perhaps most famously by Descartes in the first of his meditations, is how do we avoid the skepticism, the view that we can't really know anything about the world. And Descartes famously raised the issue as to how do I know I'm not dreaming everything that I'm experiencing? How do I know that I'm just not having these experiences of being in a room and speaking to a screen and hoping that people are going to listen to it, and I'm not just dreaming about these things? So that's a major challenge that a number of people concerned with epistemology are meant to address. How can we know anything? And perhaps how do we show that the skeptic is wrong if we think the skeptic is wrong? A similar type of issue is how and to what extent can our beliefs be justified? And another sort of issue is what's the main sources of our knowledge? Is all our knowledge gained or justified by sensory experience? And traditionally, there's a certain way of viewing some philosophers, major philosophers in the history of philosophy, as empiricists, some of them who think that all our knowledge is gained by experience, and rationalists who think there's another type of insight that we can gain independent of sensory experience. And these philosophers are typically called rationalists. So that's just a brief indication of the sorts of things that are discussed in theoretical philosophy, in particular in the areas of metaphysics and theory of knowledge. With regard to practical philosophy, what's called practical philosophy, a major part of it is moral philosophy. Here, a number of issues concerning what is good, or what is valuable more generally, and another type of issue is what is beautiful. What is it that makes something good, if it is good, or beautiful, or valuable? And then, in addition to asking what it is that makes it good, what in fact is good? Is happiness good in itself? Is happiness good? Or is doing good, right things, is that what's good? What exactly is it that makes something good? And what are the good things that we should do or aspire to do? And a broad issue involved in this area is the issue of whether all value or goodness and so on, is that objective or is it relative? Is there a fact of the matter as to what makes something good? Or is it just what my community thinks is good or desires that make something good? Is goodness relative to communities or to individuals? And similarly, there's the issue about what makes an act right. Does it depend on the outcome? Or are there some things that should be done or not done regardless of the outcome? Is it ever right to lie or to kill someone? Or is those things somehow wrong in themselves that should never be done? And another major part of practical philosophy is political philosophy. And here, these sorts of questions about what makes a government legitimate. Is there a best form of government? How should or can we balance such principles as equality and liberty? So should we favor societies where everybody has equal incomes, but perhaps they don't have the liberty, the freedom to gain more money if they want? Or on the other hand, should we privilege liberty and sacrifice equality? And how can one argue for one of these views as opposed to another? So these are the sorts of issues that one might address in political philosophy. So I've tried to give you a sense of some of the major areas of philosophy, both theoretical and practical. Now I want to turn to the second question: what does studying philosophy at Trinity involve? Well, there's three pathways to studying philosophy at Trinity. The first is called joint honors, where you study philosophy in combination with one other subject. There's what's called PPES, where you study a combination of philosophy, politics, economics, and sociology. And there's single honors philosophy, where the focus is just on philosophy. And now I might add that regardless of which of these pathways you choose, there are opportunities to study other departments than the ones that you are officially and primarily studying. And there's even opportunities to, as you develop in your education, to come to realize, well, maybe I want to focus on another department more than I thought when I joined. And you could, as it were, switch or add a new department subject to be part of your major. Now, so the main structure of the program, regardless of whether you're doing which of those pathways you choose to do, is that the first 2 years provide the foundations for your study of philosophy. And the second 2 years, there's more electives and choice where you get to focus on the particular areas of philosophy you're most interested in. So in particular, in the first year, one of the courses you take is a full year sequence of topics and central problems of philosophy. And here you get an introduction to such areas as moral philosophy, philosophy of mind, political philosophy, and metaphysics, and these sorts of issues. Another part of the first 2 years is a 2-year sequence in the history of philosophy, which really focuses on Western philosophy from the ancient Greeks through the 20th century. And there you'll study, these classical ancient philosophers, as I mentioned, Plato and Aristotle. You'll study these modern philosophers from the 16th, 17th century onwards, including Descartes, Trinity's Berkeley, Kant. You'll study and as well as into 20th century philosophers, including figures such as Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. In the second year, you'll also take a course, a full year sequence. For the first semester, it'll be logic, and the second semester, the philosophy of science. So in logic, you'll learn certain methods of argumentation, of determining whether an argument's valid or not, and in the philosophy of science, raising issues about the nature and justification of science. In the second 2 years, the third and fourth years, as I mentioned, you'll have a chance to focus on the areas of philosophy that interest you the most. You'll take seminars in your fourth year, and you'll write a dissertation. Now, if you do single honors philosophy, the dissertation will be in philosophy. If you do philosophy in a combination with another subject, you can write a dissertation in philosophy, or you can do what's called a capstone project in the other subject. So single honors philosophy, what distinguishes it from the other pathways into philosophy that I mentioned, is that in the first 2 years, in addition to these courses that I mentioned on central problems, on history and on logic and philosophy of science, you'll take extra smaller group classes in those first 2 years that are only open to single honor students. These include other topics in philosophy, including Chinese philosophy, and there'll be also courses focusing on central philosophical texts. One feature of philosophy is that it's a subject in which there's current debate on certain issues, and where there can be a lot of focus on recent literature and journal articles and so on, discussing issues of contemporary debate. But it's also a subject, and it's taught at Trinity with a respect for the history of the subject, where a good understanding of the history of the subject enhances one's understanding of contemporary debates. And in philosophy, there are a number of great works of writing, in addition to philosophical argument, including, for example, Plato and Aristotle, as I mentioned, Descartes and Berkeley and Hume and these figures. And if you do single honors philosophy in the second year, there'll be a course where you go in depth on certain central philosophical texts. And then in the third and fourth years, single honor students take more courses in philosophy than do students who are taking philosophy as well as another subject in those years. And every single honor student in philosophy, as I mentioned, writes a dissertation. One feature of being a philosophy student is that you learn to write a philosophy essay. And regardless of whether you go on into study more philosophy to get a higher degree in philosophy, or whether you choose to do something else, one of the main benefits of a degree in philosophy is having learned to write a philosophy essay. And so this is one of the most important skills you will acquire as a philosophy student. And in writing a philosophy essay, the key point is not to summarize what other people have said, or to regurgitate, one might say, information that others have presented. Is to distill certain views and to create an argument of your own, to defend a certain claim and to clearly state what that claim is, and then to write an essay in which you defend that claim. So the essay will be a structured argument of defense of that claim. And as I mentioned, whatever you do in life beyond a philosophy degree, having gone through the process of studying these classic works and of understanding debates on these fundamental issues, and in learning to write in essays in which you present your own views and in an argued, structured way, is a lasting value beyond the mere philosophy degree. So I hope you think about studying philosophy if it's of interest to you. Thank you for listening.